let's go ahead and get started and kick off with understanding the SharePoint Backup component architecture. I think this is really the most important aspect of really getting your head around this tool. The tool is can seem complicated because there are definitely a lot of moving parts, but once we internalize what these different component pieces do and how they talk and what their role is in the workflow, I think understanding that workflow really helps to internalize the tool's functionality at the highest level. The backup architecture from the top down. So this is a very rough kind of visualization of the component architecture for SharePoint Backup. So the top two or three nodes, I should say, we've got this MetaLogic SharePoint Backup Management Console in the top left. Now this represents the UI element that we look at. He talks to a so-called management service, who in turn talks to a repository database you see up at the upper right. In addition to that database, the management service also talks to these various SharePoint servers with the MetaLogic SharePoint Backup service installed, right? So these could be WFEs, they could be database servers, they could be application servers, search, index, et cetera, et cetera. Any server in the farm that makes up your farm will have a SharePoint Backup service installed to it, and our management service will communicate to those guys to initiate operations. So let's look a little bit closer at each of these components just to see what it is exactly they're doing. And I'll try to jump back to this slide every now and then to refer back to this workflow. So first and foremost, we've got this management console component. And this is essentially the application UI. This is what the end user, I say end user, but what I really mean is the farm administrator who's using the SharePoint Backup tool. The user of SharePoint Backup will more than likely be working from within the context of this management console UI component, right? So this deploys to any Windows operating system, I think since, honestly, I think we go back all the way to XP. We can use this console to manage single or multiple farms, and that bullet there says dependent upon management service and repository database requirements. We'll touch on this in more detail in next week's installation example. But suffice it to say, in order to manage multiple farms with this tool, you essentially have to install this tool separately to each farm, but then you can manage all those independent installations from a single management console UI interface on whatever workstation you've got it installed to. So that ties into the next point. We can have multiple users leveraging different consoles from different workstations, all pointing back to the same main installation backend. So in the case of a single farm scenario, let's say we have all these different components, the management service, the repository, the backup services, all installed to these farm machines. And then on several different end user workstations, we may have one or more management consoles running independently, pointing back to that installation, giving us access to those components to manage our SharePoint Backup needs. Each console reads metadata from the repository database to be shown within the graphical UI. What that means is that every piece of information we're seeing in that console, the backup operation details, timestamps of backups, the backup type, the duration, all the configuration details, like what backups are scheduled, what the grooming configuration looks like, the alerts, all those pieces of information represent records in our repository database. We're just literally taking those records and putting them in a graphical format for you to view in the UI. That will become relevant as we start to look at these other components and how they talk. So I guess for the workflow here, part of what this upper left management console component does is read that data from the repository database after having been written by the management service, and we'll come back to that in just a second. So moving along to that repository database, the database can kind of be considered a large configuration file for the installation. So we're storing config information, backup and restore operational data, statistical and management service collected data. So that includes stuff like the backup service host names. What servers in the farm are hosting backup services? The service order or role of each of those backup services, i.e. which of these backup services is the primary backup service. So we'll talk more about him in a moment. Information regarding the scheduled backups. When are my schedules kicking off? Are they fulls? Are they differentials? What components are involved in those backups, et cetera, et cetera. Grooming configurations. How often do I want to delete data from my backup set location? How old do I want to keep data? Do I want to delete things after 2 weeks, after 90 days, et cetera, et cetera? And then alerting configurations. Every time a successful or failed backup occurs, we can opt to have an email sent out or see an alert message in our UI. So those obviously are records represented in that database as well. So each management service, and by that I mean really each installation of SharePoint Backup, uses a unique repository database. So for instance, in that scenario of multiple farms, let's say if I'm managing 3 farms of SharePoint Backup, I'm really talking about 3 complete installations of SharePoint Backup with their own unique management services and repository databases, right? The one thing to note here is that the repository database does not store backed up content. So a backup set is not something that can be easily stored within a repository database. We actually have a separate, we'll restore the actual backed up data on the file system in a location on the network that we specified. All we store in the repository is metadata about those backup sets. So again, did the backup complete or fail? That's a record in the repository. What components were backed up, et cetera, et cetera. So metadata about the backup sets, but not the backup sets themselves.